All right, welcome back, everybody. Rick is now exchanging our water bottles because based on the last conference he held, which was at the inception of COVID, he wants to make sure he is not responsible for any additional virality here. I've been catastrophizing as to what this conference might be the prelude to, given the last conference seemed to engineer and generate the pandemic. And so, you know, whether it's the earthquake or any number of other things, I think we should be on our best behavior and be prepared. This panel is going to talk about the role of media and social media. We've got an all-star panel as we have throughout the entire day. We'll follow the same format that we did in the previous panel. We will start, I'll say, with forgive the characterization, Pam, but with legacy media, and then move into new media. And so we start with Pam Fessler, who was for many years one of the foremost reporters on elections in the U.S. For NPR. And then we've got two clinical professors from UC Irvine, Jack Lerner and David Kaye. And then following them will be Brendan Nyhan from Dartmouth. So take it away, Pam.
Thank you very much, Nate. And not only am I legacy media, but I'm a legacy person from legacy media, so I'm very old. Anyway, thank you very much. Thank you, Rick, for inviting me here. We were asked basically first of all, what were some of the lessons we learned in 2020? And then obviously, what are some of the challenges for 2024? I think the biggest lesson I and many others learned in 2020 was just how little the public knew about how our elections were run. And it was this lack of information or lack of knowledge that made our system vulnerable to people who wanted to undermine the legitimacy of our elections. So not only did we have a public that really didn't understand that much about how elections were run, quite frankly, I think as the last panel referenced, most people didn't even really want to know how elections were run. The less they knew, the better. It was the same actually with election officials. The less attention they got, the better, because that basically meant that things were running properly. But we had a pandemic, which completely upended how our 2020 elections were run. I don't know if everybody recalls this, but it broke out in March, right when many states were starting to hold their primaries. Election officials had to completely overhaul how they were going to conduct that election. And so it was all these new processes, all these new systems, a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainty, and then we had a presidential campaign that used that confusion and uncertainty to sow doubts about our elections and also to spread disinformation. So one of the big lessons, obviously, was that not only was the public unprepared, but a lot of election officials, not Orange County, not Maricopa County, not Michigan, but a lot of election officials really weren't prepared to deal with the disinformation and weren't prepared to communicate with the public about exactly what was going on and to counter the disinformation. What disinformation they did counter often was too late. So the result, obviously, was that a lot of people, we had sort of a massive decline in public trust of our elections. So what has happened since then, there's been a lot more work done since the 2020 election, working with election officials. I've been doing a lot of the other organizations, election official groups themselves have been really trying to beef up their ability to communicate with the public. And Jocelyn and Neil and Stephen spoke about some of the things that they had done that other places have also started to adopt. And that is opening up, being more transparent with the public, bringing people in, saying, okay, come in, see how the process works, working more with the media. As I think Rick has referred to in the past, for many, many years, I was the only reporter covering election administration, one of the few national reporters in the country until about 2016. We have a lot more reporters now who are covering it. And so we've been encouraging election officials to work more closely with the media to educate reporters in the same way that they want to educate or should be educating the public. Bring them in, talk to them, develop a relationship before something terrible happens so that when something does go wrong, these election officials, these reporters will know who to talk to, what questions to ask, and what information to basically reject as BS for the most part. But until until reporters know those things, they, often what we saw in 2016 especially was reported things as facts or just had the one side said this, one side said that. But now I think it's much, much better. Obviously, a lot more work needs to be done. Stephen is gone, but I'm actually one of those reporters who asked him, is all that communication work you did over the past few years, was it effective at all? Because obviously, because Maricopa County this year was the ground zero again for a lot of disinformation. And I always look at Maricopa County as one of the best communicators with the public. They have some of the best processes of working with the media, educating the public. So we don't know. It could have been a lot worse if they weren't already doing those things. The threat has not gone away at all of the disinformation. I know for a fact that there are many they call themselves election integrity groups around the country that are meeting regularly ever since the election, talking about, they're sort of regrouping, talking about how we can challenge the next election. What are the vulnerabilities? We are seeing this with, it's not so much they're attacking the same types of things that were attacked in 2022 and 2020, such as mail-in voting, the legitimacy of mail-in voting. It's more what I see as the more kind of peripheral things that are just as fundamental for our election system. And I think one of the biggest examples recently is the attacks on ERIC, which for those of you who don't know, ERIC is a system that is used by, I guess, how many states is it now? About 30 states. Dropping, the number keeps going down. Basically, to compare the voter registration lists with other databases, it's the most effective way to update voter registration systems, but it is being attacked because of a campaign of disinformation that somehow this is, George Soros, trying to shift voter registration rolls to Democrats. Totally baseless, but it is catching on. We're seeing a lot more efforts to undermine, basically use disinformation to undermine nonpartisan efforts to help election officials deal with misinformation. So that's where we are today. So we need to do a lot more in terms of educating voters, working with election officials, supporting election officials. Secretary Benson and others mentioned building networks of people, trusted voices that can help convey this message that our elections are secure. These are the things that are being done to protect your vote and to basically help persuade the American public that they can trust their elections.
Thank you. Now, is it David Kaye?
Okay, great. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Nate. Thank you to Rick for inviting me and for being such a major motivator for all of this work for the last several years. So I just wanted to say a few words, and I'll try not to keep the full 5 minutes, although whenever I say that, I go like 10 minutes. So I want to talk a little bit about social media, and in particular, I wanted to say a few words about what we know and what we don't know. Less about what we know, because of some reasons that I'll mention. But I do want to start really simply by asking the question, how do we know what's happening on the platforms? How do we know what the platforms are actually doing in order to deal with disinformation, misinformation, sources of confusion on the platforms when it comes to elections and so forth? How do we know what they're doing is one question. And there I want to put a pin in and hope that Nate will talk a little bit about his efforts on the researcher access side and regulation that would really push for researcher access, because I think that there are initiatives on Capitol Hill that have sought to crack open the platforms to better access. I'm not sure exactly that they've proceeded as quickly or as fully as they should, but Nate has been in the lead on that, so I hope that he'll talk a little bit about that effort. And then on the other side, apart from providing researcher access, there's the question of just empirically and analytically, what is the impact of disinformation that does course through the platforms? And of course, I'm sitting next to Brendan, who's done a tremendous amount of research on that. So I imagine that he'll say a few words about that as well. What I wanted to in particular focus on is that at the moment, basically, we're relying on the platform's goodwill, on the platform's, basic sense of a responsibility to do what's right. And their sense of responsibility tends to come from what? It comes from public pressure, from political pressure, from other sorts of pressures that might motivate them to improve their community standards, their guidelines that guide what they take down, what they allow to stay up. But generally speaking, at least in the United States, it has been basically public pressure and political pressure that has moved the needle on how the companies respond to all the concerns around disinformation. I want to highlight, however, that there is a possible different approach. It's an approach, or a couple of different approaches, that the United States has not adopted and may, for First Amendment reasons, be unable to adopt ultimately. But I think there's actually something to learn from the force of regulation that is coming out of Europe. And here I want to highlight in particular two areas where we might at least focus a little bit, and I'll just sort of note them because their relevance to saving democracy in 2024 might seem at first a little bit sort of distant, but I think they might provide some ideas for us. So the first is the European Digital Services Act, the DSA, which is now in force in Europe, and it takes an approach toward both illegal content, but also sort of what we might think of as harmful content that is problematic for democracy, for the public interest. Instead of demanding that the platforms take particular action against particular kinds of content, they make demands, requirements on the platforms to do specific risk assessment and to be transparent and public about the risk assessment that they do. Now, that's very open-ended, and it's actually subject to a lot of uncertainty right now because we don't know exactly how it will be enforced, and if European enforcement around the DSA is anything like the GDPR, the major privacy regulation, we might not actually see a whole lot of change out of Europe. However, the approach of government actually demanding that the platforms be transparent about what they're doing, how they assess the risks that they cause to the public interest, is one model that we in the United States might think about as a way at least to crack open the platforms to our own assessment. It's different than sort of the researcher model that Nate might talk about, but it is a model that we might think about. Another model is the UK model, which has sort of, it's very hard to know it's hard to know anything about what's going to happen in the UK, but basically they are imposing or seeking to impose, if their online safety bill ever moves to adoption, a kind of duty of care on the platforms, which is when it comes to democratic governance and the rights of journalists and the rights of freedom of expression is a little bit unclear at the moment. But essentially, the UK may, over the course of the next year or two, require its Ofcom, its regulator of broadcast and of information in the country, to develop guidelines that the platforms would have to adopt in order to assess harms that they might cause to democratic institutions and democratic governance. So it would be what is being called in the UK a duty of care. Whether that works, whether it happens, is really uncertain at the moment. So I just want to close with that and just highlight that as we're thinking about legislative or regulatory approaches to dealing with platforms and disinformation, that there are models out there that we should put into the mix. And those models may not actually fit entirely with our constitutional requirements and our constitutional guarantees, but they certainly are approaches that we could think about in order to open up the platforms to better insight for the public.
Great, thank you. Actually, let me just take a minute. I'll just since I've been invoked, just on something called the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which is what I think David was referencing. This was a legislative effort that was sponsored in the last session by Senator Portman and Senator Coons. And that piece of legislation that I worked on, the earlier draft of, was all about trying to get greater openness to the platforms. There's part of it is about researcher access, and so there'd be a system where researchers would be able to get greater access to platform data, but then there's other provisions that would require the platforms to make public disclosures about their algorithms, about widely viewed content, and about advertising. And so it's really just trying to, get greater insight into what the platforms are doing. Turn it over to Brendan.
Me? Okay. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks to Rick. Thanks to everyone for being here. So what I'm going to speak about is the risk from disinformation on social media. That's one of the two topics of this panel. It's an important one, and I think it's especially important for us to discuss now because we spent so many hours, weeks, months, years since 2016 focused on the wrong threats, the threats that are allegedly coming from misinformation. What I mean by that is after 2016, there was a kind of panic about fake news as being responsible for Donald Trump's victory, if you all recall that moment. And ever since then, we've had a discourse that, when it considers the threats from misinformation, really focuses on mass exposure and mass persuasion. And I'm part of a group of researchers who've been working on those sorts of questions in the years since 2016. And what I want to put on the table for you now is that we've misunderstood this problem, that the problem to a first approximation is not one of mass exposure, but of concentrated exposure in the extremes. And the problem is not necessarily one of persuasion, but it's of perhaps further inflaming people who already have very strong predispositions, often extreme ones, and potentially facilitating greater extremism, mobilization, and organizing. That's a very different threat model than the idea that people are being, the algorithm is showing them misinformation and it's causing them to believe it and it's changing their opinions and behavior, and that's happening to the median voter or someone like that. That is, the median voter is calling to say they agree that I'm correct. I appreciate that. Thank you. There's simply no credible evidence of that. There's no credible evidence that there are magical micro-targeting elixirs that make mass persuasion possible, and that Facebook is responsible, or the social media platforms in general are responsible for the ways that misinformation has affected our democracy. Instead, the threat is much more centered on the political elites who are disseminating this misinformation. Okay, so if you're wondering how are people becoming exposed to misinformation about democracy, to a first approximation, they're getting it from politicians and the mass media. That is still true. Okay, it may in some cases be flowing through online channels to them, but the progenitors of online misinformation as such, the ones who are native to the digital space, they are reaching very small, very narrow, very fringe audiences. We have behavioral digital data that shows this over and over again. Does this mean we shouldn't worry about this problem? Of course not. But it means we need to understand it correctly and not simply externalize the threat and say the social media platforms are responsible. That doesn't mean also that we should let the social media platforms off the hook. In many ways, they're being held accountable for policies and platform affordances that focus on the wrong problem. Again, if the problem isn't the median voter, but is instead these high consumption extremist minorities that consume lots of dubious information, including lots of dubious information, say, about the legitimacy of the 2020 election, that leads to a different set of policy decisions that we might hope the platforms would make, and that we should be holding them accountable for when we look at the kinds of transparency measures that already exist. So going forward, what this means, I think, is we need to think much more carefully about how to hold the platforms accountable for this kind of fringe consumption and organizing behavior. That's going to be especially important in a 2024 context where, of course, on Twitter, Elon Musk is letting it rip and anything goes. So we will expect very few guardrails there. And all the other social media companies are frantically laying people off as this kind of tech recession rolls forward. So we should expect them to be less responsive, to have fewer trust and safety professionals working on these issues, et cetera. It's going to be very important not to let our guard down. And that risk is in some ways greater because, of course, as I've told you, with the concentration of exposure happening in the tails, it's easy for us to miss, okay? And what I want to conclude with is just talking about how these harms could take place through social media. What I'm more worried about then, rather than mass persuasion, is the kind of narrow-casted, fringe information flows that are driving, for instance, the mobilization of activists who are in turn influencing the behavior of politicians. So you recall in the last panel, the Maricopa County Recorder was talking about what it took to win a primary on the Republican side in Arizona right now. You must attest to the 2020 election being stolen and perhaps now 2022. The way social media is being used in these narrow spaces can make those kinds of views seem much more pervasive among the kinds of activists and politicians who are shaping the behavior of party actors. And that in turn is going to drive the whole machinery of the American political system. So I think we should think really hard about holding social media platforms accountable, but get the threat model right. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Jack.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Rick, for putting this on. And it's just really fun to listen to David and Brendan and Pam talk about this stuff. And your comments are fascinating. And as I was listening to your comments, I was thinking about the oral arguments that just happened last month in the Supreme Court in two cases involving Section 230 of what's called the Communications Decency Act, which is considered sort of the 26 words that change the internet or shape the internet. And Section 230 has been understood up until now to provide a safe harbor for platforms. Originally, it was designed as a safe harbor for platforms, allowing them to take content down as they saw fit. But the way that it's worded, the statute, it basically says that platforms can simply aren't going to be held liable for what's on their network. And a lot of the cases up until quite recently have said, and that includes recommendation engines, and that includes some of the kinds of targeting and some of the kinds of algorithmic selection that ends up pushing content towards some of the folks prone to be open to more extremist or fringe content, like Brennan was just talking about. And this came up in the oral arguments, and there's this distinction. For example, the government argued, the U.S. government also argued and weighed in and said largely Section 230 should be upheld, and the decision in that case, and I'll talk about what the cases were about in a second, but that the decision should largely be upheld. But the U.S. government was arguing to the Supreme Court, actually, there's a difference between simply putting something up and design defects or design choices and targeting those choices. And so there's a real question now as to how the law will change and how that will change the behavior of social media companies. And it's a really interesting a point in time for folks who have been following Section 230. So the Gonzalez versus Google case and the Twitter versus Tomnik case, those are the names of these two companion cases, and they both involve the Aiding and Abetting Terrorism Act, and they involve terrorist murders, and the victims brought suit against Google and Twitter, arguing that they were liable, that these platforms were liable because they drove content towards ISIS and people prone to commit terrorist acts. And so that's what the case were about. There were dozens of amicus briefs. So you had Ted Cruz arguing, the platforms are moderating too much and let everybody back on. And then you had the Lawyers Committee for Freedom of the Press arguing that the platforms aren't moderating enough. There are all kinds of harassment and civil rights violations taking place that are being facilitated, and so more moderation needs to happen. The U.S. came in and said, well, mostly leave it alone, but there's a big difference between targeted recommendations and failure to block. And then you had others arguing for a test called the Henderson test, which is based on a decision out of the Fourth Circuit that came down last year that would radically restrict the scope of 230, and so 230 would only, right now it applies to, largely is understood until the Supreme Court weighs in, to apply to really any kinds of decisions that the platforms make, as long as they're not the ones creating the content or editing the content. But curating, recommendation engines, obviously algorithms, are all protected by Section 230 under what the latest jurisprudence. But the Henderson test in the Fourth Circuit said no, Section 230 only applies where there's improper content in the publication, like defamation or something. And anything that isn't about the improper content of the publication is fair game and is not covered by Section 230. So there's a radical restriction of what 230 has been interpreted to mean by courts for 20-some years now. And so during oral argument, the counsel for Google, who is a very seasoned Supreme Court litigator and appears before the Supreme Court all the time, hinted that this test might actually go most of the way. My own take is that the Supreme Court is probably not going to upend Section 230 and radically restrict Section 230. Some commentators who follow the court a lot more closely than I do, or Supreme Court specialists, think that maybe what really happened in this case is that some of the more conservative folks who really want to restrict Section 230, who want to undo New York Times versus Sullivan even, which is the landmark defamation libel case from 1964, that really what happened was some of the conservatives on the court said, let's take this case so we can really get into Section 230 and kind of do what Senator Cruz did and make it more difficult to restrict misinformation, disinformation, or content by people whose views might be aligned with theirs or more extreme. So that's one opinion, and the second half of that opinion is they may have picked the wrong case, because this case really is about, well, to what extent is Google and Twitter liable for violating the Aiding and Abetting Terrorism Act, and that's actually a pretty narrow question. So, will they muddy the waters? Very likely. Will the court muddy the waters? Will the court gut Section 230 and leave it a tiny fraction of what it was? I would say probably not. Will they restrict it in some ways? Probably, right? So Section 30 probably won't be as broad. But the bigger question is, well, what is that going to mean for Twitter and Facebook? Or more accurately, in my view, what is that going to mean for Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg? And how is that going to affect their behavior? And I don't know that there will be that many material or really radical changes in their behavior based on whatever comes down in these two cases. As closely as they are watched, even given the number of people that weighed in, it's really going to come down to to what extent. What I don't see a mechanism by which these platforms will end up really being forced to do what Brendan is getting towards recommending, which is trying to when it comes to the platforms, trying to somehow stop or steer the platforms away from feeding these extremist or extremism prone or extremism friendly users towards insurrection or election denialism or things like that. So what's the takeaway? Section 230, I think, is very likely still here to stay in large part. One other factoid to add or one other aspect to think about is the court is, if you completely gut Section 230, you're also gutting modern search engines, and you wouldn't be able to have Google search function the way it does. And the court's not wanting to do that. They're pretty clear. And maybe the court will end up listening to the comment of Justice Kagan, who said, I think it was Justice Kagan who said, we are not the 9 greatest experts on the internet, which everybody in the Supreme Court chamber really appreciated.
Thank you. Well, so now, Brendan, you were just invoked. Let me give you a chance to respond. And I just on sort of, if you were Mark Zuckerberg, what would you be doing to respond to the concerns that you raised or that Jack amplified?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Let me elaborate a little just to be clear about what I mean. So I recently co-authored a study on YouTube and exposure to extremist and fringe content on that platform. That's an example of a case where people have a story about how algorithms supposedly radicalize people. What we found was, at least in 2020, the overwhelming majority of the people consuming content from problematic channels were people who already had very high levels of racial and gender resentment. The algorithm very rarely recommended that content to people who didn't already subscribe to channels of that type. So it was not, to a first approximation, a problem of algorithms. It was people self-selecting into terrible content. Does that mean YouTube is innocent? No, of course not. Why? Because they're providing this incredible platform to those channels to reach that fringe audience and to monetize it and mobilize those folks, right? So, but we've been having the wrong conversation. Everyone who's scrutinizing YouTube is focused on this rabbit hole story, which we found literally a few dozen examples of in millions and millions of views of YouTube in our data, right? This kind of sequence where people otherwise, normal people suddenly move via algorithmic recommendations to fringe content, right? That story, at least in 2020, barely happened. What happened a lot was people who were really resentful went and found terrible, terrible content that played to their predispositions. So that's what we should be worrying about. And I do think transparency will help. Transparency will provide data that third-party stakeholders can use to put pressure on the platforms to change what they're doing, and in a manner that's consistent with our First Amendment protections. I do think that's really important. I appreciate David bringing up the regulatory aspects that are, regulatory developments that are happening right now, and they're very interesting and they're very important. I would just caution everyone, though, to really think carefully about how those could be misused. We have a First Amendment for a reason. I would encourage you to think about your mental model of the president you like least and imagine them controlling such an apparatus. What would President Trump have done during his time in office with a DSA-style set of powers in place? With the ability, Trump as secretaries of state in a world where we have these kinds of laws against spreading false information about elections, right? Are we really confident those won't be misused, right? It seems like judges held the line in 2020. I defer to all the lawyers in the room. There are a lot of them. But are we sure that's true for all time? Well, I think we should think really hard about these questions. And that's why I think transparency is a really important first step before we start breaching these firewalls we've put in place, I think, for considered reasons.
So Brendan talked about social media. Pam, if you were to make recommendations to legacy media, I shouldn't say
No,
legacy.
yeah.
Let's say print, TV, and radio as to what they should be doing. And you talked a lot about this in your prepared remarks too, but are there lessons going forward that they should take?
Well, I think it's the same thing that a journalist should be doing in any case and have been doing for years, and that's actually report and try and find out what reality is and what's true. So what you see on social media, how you deal with some of these social media messages, you just can't take it. Reporters can't just take it for what it's worth. You have to, talk to people. You have to, really research. You have to find out what actually is going on. So that you can report the most accurate, and in the most accurate way, what in fact is happening and whether or not this is misinformation or whether or not it's true. And that goes back to this whole idea of having a relationship ahead of time with people who are running our elections so that some idea how the process really works and whether or not you can trust them to be telling you the truth. I mean, one of our big challenges, of course, is that, not just legacy media, but media overall, news media overall is contracting. So we have this, massive continued evaporation of local news sources. I think about 40% of local news outlets or circulation has declined, has been eliminated since I think it was 2015. You also have just NPR recently just said that it announced that it's going to cut 10% of its staff, and that's on top of a cut of, a hiring freeze for the past year. So it's effectively a 20% cut. But you have this throughout the media, and you have reporters who just really don't have the time, obviously, to go into a lot of this. To do the really in-depth reporting that's needed to be done. I think the one other thing I just wanted to note with what my fellow panelists have said, election officials really don't know how to respond to this flood of social media disinformation. There's efforts too. A lot of them are just starting to use social media. I mean, it's sort of amazing how many did not use social media even in the 2020 election. I think only 8% even had a Twitter account at the time. And they also don't know, there needs to be a lot more research on what's the most effective way to counter this, right? What are the best methods? Is pre-bunking better than debunking? Should you actually even deal with the misinformation, or should you try and spread messages that are more, positive and proactive, such as you can trust our elections because they're run by your neighbors and your friends? So a lot more work needs to be done on that, and I think we're just starting to see a little bit of research on that.
Can I ask you just a little indulgent question, which is,
No.
how did you, because you were one of the earliest people covering election administration, how did you get into it? Because it's sort of a unique, path.
It was after the 2020 election, the 2000 election, which obviously a lot of people were covering.
Right.
And there was some movement in Congress to do something, and they needed somebody to go up and cover the Help America Vote Act. And I still remember that first press conference, going up there, and actually Mitch McConnell was one of the sponsors. It was a bipartisan effort. There were a bunch of election experts and officials there, and I started talking to him. I'm like, wow, this is really fascinating. And I'm kind of a geeky person, so I found it really interesting. So an election official, the whole process is so fascinating to me and so fundamental. And I just continued to cover it even, in years that it wasn't even that controversial, because it just seemed so important to me, and I just found fascinating.
Wonderful. David, it looked like you wanted to jump in. I have a question for you also, but go.
So I just, a couple of things. One is, I don't think the DSA, the way it's structured, I don't think it poses the problem of, a Trumpist sort of actor taking it over and using it as a tool to pressure either the platforms or individual speakers, mainly because what it does is it works on the level of requirements related to transparency and risk assessment, but also puts it into the hands of independent agencies across the European Union. But what I really wanted to highlight, and it goes to both traditional media or legacy, whatever we're calling it, and also social media, and the point that in the United States, were consistently reluctant to use legislative tools, the tools of law, in order to sort of press either kinds of media into particular directions. So for one example, there has been some discussion over the last couple of years of whether there are legislative or regulatory approaches to promote local media. Whether it's through funding or through different kinds of subsidization or what, eventually I can speak. It's just early, daylight savings has screwed me up. And I can only use that, I think, through today. So that's, one part of it is we're just reluctant to engage in kind of the positive steps to promote local journalism that I think Pam rightly highlights is an important thing, or public media. And then on the other hand, we're also reluctant to push social media or other parts of the internet economy to do certain things, so we rely on self-regulation. And that may just not be enough given the kinds of threats that Brendan has highlighted. So I think that part of our thinking around this, that I think maybe this conference can think through, is whether there is a role for government in pushing in either direction here, or whether it comes down to public pressure, to self-regulation, other tools like that. I think that's a real open question for us.
So that dovetails with the question I want to ask you, which is, look, you were the UN Rapporteur on Free Expression for how many years?
6.
6 years. So you're pretty familiar with worldwide regulation of the internet. Pointed to the EU, Britain, we've talked about the US. Is anybody doing it right in your view? And if not, what might be the lesson there? And also, you've got some pretty egregious examples from your experience of oppression and suppression of speech.
Yeah. By and large, countries are doing it wrong. If you look sort of globally at the scope of government pressure on the platforms, it's pretty awful. It tends to be focused on protection against, criticism of government, or, denigration of opposition parties online, things like that. It is, generally speaking, there is kind of a reckoning. Part of it is because around the world, so many governments and politicians, public figures, are just alienated from, essentially American social media and internet giants. So it doesn't look very good out there. You have things like Singapore adopting an online falsehoods law that really gives members of the government the ability to specifically make demands of companies to take down content without a judicial oversight. And that's Singapore, so you might expect that, but that is a trend. But I would say that the DSA is not a bad model. It has risks, but the idea of focusing on risk assessment and also on focusing on bringing in civil society stakeholders to be a part of the assessment of what's happening online. That means civil society in the form of activists and human rights defenders, but also researchers who, like Brendan and his teams, who are really trying to understand what's happening on the platforms. It opens it up, and it's a regulatory function that does that.
Jack wanted to make a point, and I want to hand the mic over to him. But as I do so, if you have questions, please come to the mics on both sides of the room. Jack.
So I have a point and a question. One of the points is that David's report to the Commissioner on Human Rights on content moderation goes into this a lot and has some incredibly creative and I just think brilliant recommendations on what private companies can do, what governments can do to build human rights principles into content moderation. So it's really interesting. But I have a question from Brendan because I found Zeynep Tufekci's op-ed from several years ago, which I know you're clearly familiar with. It's entitled "YouTube: The Great Radicalizer," and I've observed this myself. If I want to watch the "I'm Just a Bill" song from 1973 or whatever, and I have autoplay on, if I just let it go for an hour or three, before you know it, I'm like watching QAnon content, And so Zeynep's argument was more or less, that this autoplay and YouTube's recommendation engine and more broadly algorithms that try to prioritize emotionally exciting content that gets that, and the algorithms have found that kind of content gets people to stay on the site. That's what's driving the radicalization. So my question for you is, one question for you is, do you think that that's what's actually going on, or is it more that, and I think there's some real plausibility here, when you have a respected elite leader who is trusted by a large group within the party or within the movement saying something that's not true, right? And then you have a lot of people primed to do that. They'll take that and run with it, and that's what's really driving the radicalism. And then, of course, at that point, that's when YouTube becomes a great radicalizer. And so that's kind of my question for you: is do you buy Zeynep's thesis in that piece, which to me has been very influential, or is it more? So that's my question.
Yeah, real quick, because I want to make sure we have time for the audience questions. Our data are from 2020, and so we can't rule out that the story Zeynep describes was happening before Google substantially overhauled the YouTube algorithm in 2019. So that's just a limit of the science. There is no good science external to YouTube on how their algorithm worked. It's a limit of the failures of transparency in the earlier era. So I can't speak to that point directly, but I can say the people we were seeing who were overwhelmingly consuming this content afterwards were registering very high levels of racial resentment 2 years in advance. Okay, so we had survey measures of their racial resentment from 2018. We're looking at their behavior in 2020. They're already hitting the top of the scale or very near it, some of these folks, the ones who are consuming the most of this harmful content, 2 years before. Now, they could have been radicalized by YouTube in 2018 prior to taking the survey, and then we're seeing them 2 years later. But that seems to me like a very elaborate bank shot in terms of the bulk of the evidence here, which is just simply we have a lot of racially resentful and otherwise resentful people in society, and they now have the ability to get narrow-casted content that is tailored to their interests and predispositions, and that may be a fringe in terms of the percentage of the population it makes up, but it can be a very dangerous and destabilizing fringe when it's concentrated and monetized in the way that platforms enable. So that's what I worry about.
Why don't we start over here? We'll go right, left, and say who you are.
Yes, hello. My name is Adam Barclay. I'm a researcher at Watchdog Group American Oversight. And I was curious, the conversation has justifiably focused a lot on the major platforms in which the information's available and public to almost everyone. But with the collapse of a lot of local media, the collapse of Twitter as kind of a platform where the public conversation is happening, it seems that there's a lot more energy, particularly in the extremes in encrypted or ephemeral platforms, places like Telegram or Rumble that are often invisible to a lot of decent people who don't want to spend time there. And I'm curious in terms of revising the threat model, how we account for that. And if we're not already at a point where the energy there is self-sustaining to the point where kind of legal, I don't want to say censorship, but moderation wouldn't be effective at containing that misinformation threat. Thank you.
Do you want to deal with that?
There's still, so the fringe social media platforms are relatively small in the US in mass audience, and encrypted messaging I think is a growing threat, but I'd say at this point it's a much larger threat overseas. So folks who are worried about threats from misinformation to democracy are very worried about the role of apps like WhatsApp and how it spreads misinformation in places like Brazil and India. Right, so if I were thinking about where this threat is greatest, that's what I would worry about. And the nature of encrypted messaging just makes this a very hard problem. It's not clear at all what content moderation looks like, if anything, what transparency looks like, if anything. And that's going to be a huge issue going forward. But I think it's one that's less central in the US.
So the light is blinding me as to who's in line over there. So I will trust the community over there to delegate.
I have a very generous community supporting me.
All right, please,
Thanks, guys.
please ask your question.
I'm Nicole Schneidman. I'm a technology policy advocate at Protect Democracy, and immediately before that, I was at Meta working on Facebook group integrity. I'm really curious to better understand what specific kinds of transparency provisions we need to be putting in place, especially given the point that if the threat is really anchoring on ensuring that these folks that are already predisposed towards seeking out extremist content, then what do we need in terms of reporting requirements of the companies? What data do researchers need access to? Like, what is the brass tacks of making transparency as effective as possible, especially given the like broad range of options that we could take in putting these kinds of policies in place?
Do you want to start with your wish list and I'll go to mine, or?
Yeah. Well, I would just say it's a great question. We need to be specific about what we're looking for, and I guess I would say first, some of the bigger platforms have become better actually at their transparency over the last. And I'm looking generally at the light. I don't know. So they've become better, and they've become better. I think particularly on the side of transparency about the rules themselves. We know more about what the rules are. Meta is a pretty good example, partly helped by the Facebook Oversight Board of showing more about what those rules mean. I still think we have very, very limited information about how those rules are kind of across the board implemented and interpreted. So we get sort of the edge cases, but we don't know, like day after day, how those rules are actually being implemented, and we could use more data about that. In 2018, I called for a kind of case law, developing kind of case law around this. Whether that's plausible is another question, but I think we just need to have more transparency about that. I do think we need more transparency. And here's where I would just transition to Nate, because I do think we need transparency of the kind that is quite open-ended. In other words, it gives researchers, and a transparency that gives researchers the opportunity to sort of follow their instincts as to, for example, algorithmic impacts on data flows and curation, which is simply really opaque at the moment. And that's the kind of thing that I think I would like to see more of.
One thing I'll just emphasize for people who are not in this world is that obviously there is a need to protect user privacy at the same time. And so we have to strike the balance correctly so that outside researchers or outsiders in general don't have any access to private communications, and just that we can just get aggregated findings about sort of dynamics on social media. But I also just point to the specific provisions in the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act as to what on algorithms, on advertising, on widely viewed content that I think are indicative of the kind of data that researchers would like. Did you want to jump in? Yeah, and then well go over here.
30-second. Facebook is rumored to be shutting down its CrowdTangle transparency tool. That would be very bad. It only covers public pages. That's very bad. Its widely viewed content reports are once per quarter and at the page level. That's really bad. So these need to be faster. So we need to pair these kinds of deep researcher access provisions with thinner, faster kinds of transparency measures that allow people like you, it's protect democracy, to kind of pull the ripcord and say something bad is happening. Like Google Trends style tools that just let you see what kinds of content is circulating while protecting user privacy on a daily or hourly or minute by minute level would be super powerful at creating opportunities for stakeholders to call for more transparency, more accountability, more investigation.
Mm-hmm. Hi, my name is Michael Karanikolas. I run the UCLA Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy, which is a collaboration between the School of Law and the School of Engineering here. I wanted to pick up on something that I think a couple of you mentioned related to support for sustainable journalism, because there are initiatives on the international side that connect that to the platforms. Thinking in particular about EU initiatives related to expanding intellectual property rights to channel funding from the digital ad space towards local journalism. Similarly, there's the Australian model, which has received a lot of attention, which includes a mandate to bargain. I'm interested to if to the extent to which any of the panelists think those models might be applicable here, as well as any trade-offs or threats of government capture that flow from that, because those are concerns that have been floated.
So I'm not familiar at all with, the examples that you gave, but we do have an increase in more nonprofit journalism efforts, and some that are focused specifically on elections and voting and democracy, which I think are very good. Like we have one called Vote Beat, which is doing some of the best reporting, I think, local reporting on what's going on in elections. Even though I'm an NPR person, and we did get some of our funding from from government, I actually think it's the best, the less the government's involved in any media organizations, the better.
So I can't see the speaker over there, but I know the shadow of Bruce Kane because I've been living in it for the last 25 years. And so I will send over to my former dissertation chair, Bruce Kane, for the final question.
Well, the bad news is that we revoked your dissertation last week. I find, actually, I'm glad there's a glare. I find that I look better as I get older when there's a harsh glare. So look, the thrust of a lot of your concerns, and it's legitimate, is about trying to weed out misinformation. But I want to I want to pick up on Brendan's theme, which is, he says a lot of this is about mobilizing the people that were already converted to craziness, okay? So then the question is, maybe we have to reframe this a little differently and see that what we really have is an opportunity for detection of craziness and where it's going. Now, people have a right to say crazy things, but when it goes to actions which are problematic, like threatening the people that we just heard in the last panel, then it seems to me we want to know about this, and we want to know about it early. We want to know if these threats were emerging months before so that we can get the law enforcement in the right places, right? And by the way, what happens in different states, we know from the Charles Stewart data that what happens in local communities, for the most part, people are pretty happy with local officials, but everybody's focusing on a few of these major events. So we can get on top of them early. So the question is, could we do a better job? If you ask every one of these local officials to develop their own communication strategy and detecting strategy, that's just not going to happen. They don't have the money for it, and they need a coordinated action because they're not professional politicals, consultants. They don't have that sophistication, and to go out and try to acquire it is not possible. But shouldn't we have a national effort of some sort that throws in not only the social media you're talking about, detecting where the threats are coming very early, scraping the web with big data, and figuring out where it's coming from, add in the public records request, because that is an indicative of a strategy, right? And the lawsuit potential, and just that will tell you where the pressure points in the system, but it cannot be done really just by a state-by-state basis. It has to be an effort on the part of all of us. So let's, reframing it to a detection device, do we see social media as something that's an opportunity for us to get out ahead of these problems?
Brendan, why don't I give you the last word on that?
No, I think it's a great point. It's going to be more transparent there. We're going to see these things developing. Of course, there's always the risk of overreacting to very small bits of talk that never lead anywhere, but we've learned we need to be risk averse in this space. So I think that makes sense. And I would just point people actually to the efforts of the, I always get the acronym wrong, the CISA. CISA?
CISA.
See, this is how I'm not totally in this world. CISA had a kind of, it's called a rumor controls website during the 2020 election, where it was trying to debunk election rumors and misinformation in real time, and it amounted to a kind of information subsidy to the state secretaries of state and local election officials who could then repurpose those in their own jurisdictions. There may be some real scope for that kind of effort rather than trying to have each individual election official fighting their own information war. I agree very much with Bruce, that's a bad idea.
And just real quickly, I mean, those efforts at CISA and elsewhere, I mean, they were national, but it was part of a network with election officials, state, so it was very much a two-way street. So that work is going on a national level.
With that, I'll end this panel, and I think we have a break for 15 minutes. Thanks very much.
That was great.